Good morning, everybody. Thank you for these fantastic talks over the last 3 days. I would consider myself as being at the periphery of studies on civil society, but being an economic geographer over the last years, I came across the enormous relevance that civil society and philanthropy especially has also for regional economic development. So, economic geography is a field of research that takes an interest in the variations of structures and also the particularities of trajectories in the way that economies evolve in regions, and differently so, between places and across space. When I came to Heidelberg 10 years ago, I was asked, and that's something that happens frequently to geographers, I was asked by the local mayor and the local government to assess the state of the creative and cultural industries in Heidelberg. A debate that you may well know because it has gone around the world. Every major city wanted to be a creative city, wanted to have a large creative class in order to be the top tier for future innovation and economic development. But then when we conducted interviews, I realized that you cannot understand the way that the creative economy and the cultural economy works in a city as Heidelberg if you ignore the enormous influence of patrons, of philanthropy, and of civil organizations that are in support of the arts, for example, and that are so important for bohemians and for artistic activities that are not successful commercially. So then there rose an interest in understanding better what philanthropy is, how it works, and what its potential role is in the economy of a region. So that is the interest I'm taking. The talk that I present today is based on, as you will see, very intensive empirical work that most of the time Laura has done in a previous research project that we've done together. The research was then motivated really to explore the realities of philanthropy from an explicitly geographical perspective. So when we started reading the literature, we realized that the literature to us was organized around sectoral perspectives. And a lot of the discussions that I have witnessed over the last days was also organized by the criterion of who are the actors. So there are foundations, and there's and a center on foundations and research on foundations. And foundations are different from charitable associations, and they're again different from giving circles. And there seems to be a lot of professionalization within this field of civil society on types of actors. Now, to us, when you take a geographical perspective, you don't look at the reality in segmenting into sectors, you look at how it comes together in a place. So I needed an alternative perspective, and we've heard it already. Mario, and I think we share a deep understanding or a deep will to understand reality from a relational perspective. We organize the way we approach things through networks very much. And what helps then, and that's also what Mario proposed, is a perspective of a field. So what I hope I can transfer in this presentation is the proposition of the concept of the philanthropic field as a useful analytical framework in order to approach the empirical reality of how it works. And that's the motivation for today. The philanthropic field goes beyond the non-profit sector perspective in a very narrow sense. So when we look at the non-profit sector, we have all types of organizations, foundations, charitable associations, wealthy individuals, patrons, as we might say. And we do have beneficiaries that can also be foundations and different types of organizations. We realized that, and that was published in the press, for example, that Klaus Tschira, the founder to this foundation that hosts us, actually helped at one moment a young entrepreneur who had identified a technical opportunity that he wanted to investigate and maybe later on create a product from it. He realized that a simple adhesive that we use to stick to parcels could be used as a data repository. It could be used simply like a DVD or any other storage for data. And he wanted to commercialize that. So Klaus Tschira, who had a foundation and at the same time who also has a venture capital company that invests into new ventures, in the expectation to get economic and financial returns from that, simply decided to host that young gentleman here without any expectation for compensation and just provided him the infrastructure and the money. It was a philanthropic act from a foundation to a for-profit entrepreneur. Yeah? And this is the way we try to think about it. We try to frame philanthropy around the activity, and that's why the definition is really running around the activity and not around the actors. We're not interested in the motivations, we're not interested in the types of actors and whether they qualify to be classified into a category of non-profit or for-profit. We're interested in what people do, and when they do it, their actions come into the field of philanthropy. Okay, so that's the turn that we take here. So, and this is a very simplified way of representing the idea of the field as a matrix that includes, all the worlds, the for-profit and the non-profit, and it may include all kinds of actors, and the actor list may be even more encompassing when you see the reality and study it. So the research question, and then we looked back into the literature and found that, well, there is the study of classic philanthropy, which is the giving of financial and other resources from the non-profit to the non-profit sector. We then realized that there are more recent discussions about venture philanthropy that may, go in towards other directions. And of course, we do not consider venture capital, the market for VC, as part of the philanthropic field. But the example that I just gave is one where a foundation provided money to an entrepreneur without taking an interest in its equity. So it was really giving. We want to include this. And the research questions I want to pose, and you see from the very beginning, and I'm quite explicit about it, are informed by curiosity. We would like to put this more open framework, this concept as an analytical framework for an explorative study. How does it work? What can we learn about philanthropy when we take this geographical, integrative perspective? So this motivates the questions. What are the contextual conditions of a region in favor of philanthropy? How do philanthropic actions actually define a network or the field? How do they structure the field? What's the topology? What's the connectivity in that field? Do those actors who act philanthropically collaborate with each other, and in which ways? Horizontally, vertically? Is there a division of labor between them? And how do they join forces or resources for joint projects in a region that may leverage, to a much larger extent, economic development? So another note to begin with. Last September, I was invited on an OECD mission to Coventry in England. Coventry, an industrial town just a few kilometers away from Birmingham, which considers itself to be a functional economic region that has a rural character. And Coventry, in many ways, parallels the region that I will present just in a minute in Germany. But there's one big difference between the two. I mean, they both have strength in the automotive industries. They're very industrialized, but the Coventry area has two world-class universities, Warwick University and Coventry University. The region that we will focus on in a minute has no university. Okay? And that's a major challenge. And in the end, when I conclude, you will see that this is where most has happened in terms of philanthropy. The rise of a para-university environment in the region, which is currently going on, and it's very interesting to follow that. Right, so let's talk about the region that I study. What you see here, for those who are not familiar with Germany, the map may not help that greatly, but what you see are the two southern federal states, so the German south. You see, on the right side, you see Bavaria, which is quite a large federal state in terms of surface, and you see the smaller state of Baden-Württemberg, where we are currently located. You see Mannheim, and just aside will be Heidelberg, that's where we currently are located. And you see this region here, Heilbronn-Franconia, a long name, but that's the study region for today. Heilbronn-Franconia together with the capital city region of Baden-Württemberg, Stuttgart, and two other regions in Bavaria, the capital of Munich and the northern region of Ingolstadt. They are the dark green, the four dark green regions in the south. And the south, obviously, is the economic engine of Germany. So that's the wealthiest region in Germany, and within that, these four regions are the most prosperous. They are the fastest growing regions. The region that we will focus on is the region with the highest per capita income in Germany, on average. A rather wealthy region. What they share in common, the four, is that they are all important sites for automotive industries. And it seems that the automotive industries, they are not the key and only industries in the regions, but they certainly have helped the regions over the last decade to grow. Okay, so how can you explore this quite inclusive notion of a field? And you see that the project had been motivated very early on as an empirical project with very hard work. Thank you, Laura, again for this. So, a multi-method research strategy. First of all, we looked at the regional context. You know, what about the wealthiness in the region? Is there potential to have a significant financial philanthropic activity? What about the presence of organizations that would be eligible as potential philanthropic actors? Secondly, and that's the core of it, we wanted to unpack and discover the activities and not qualify the organizations or the people in the first place. So we take this original approach of a media analysis to trace and track all publicly reported activities that include donations or endowments or any other thing between any type of actor, and then we will map the actors as a consequence of those actions and not the other way around. We also ran a survey on charitable foundations, 186 in the region. We had interviews, expert interviews with actors in the field, and we also did a network analysis of the advisory boards. There is evidently no time to discuss everything here, but I will try to at least build on 3 of those approaches and show some of the results. Okay. So let's talk about the first aspect, the regional context. 3 observations. What you see here is this observatory territorial region of Heilbronn-Franconia, roughly 1 million inhabitants, and only one, wouldn't say major, but I would say the one city in the region is the city of Heilbronn, which is the dark green one here, and then you have 4 more rural districts. The district of Heilbronn, the district of Hohenlohe-Kreis, the district of Main-Tauber-Kreis, and the district of Schwäbisch Hall. Just to read the maps. So what we see is we have overall far above average income per capita in the region, and we have the statistical highest per capita income in the city of Heilbronn. In the mid-1990s, German government abandoned a tax on private wealth. And by abandoning that tax, the state also lost transparency over private wealth, because since it had not to be reported anymore, there are no data anymore. So it's not possible in Germany to tell precisely how wealth is distributed. There are only estimates and survey techniques to basically to estimate how it could be possibly distributed. So what we did is we looked at the flows. Who are the income millionaires in Germany and in the region? And this is the second aspect you see here. So the region, and this you can tell quite precisely, has 179 income millionaires. This is not above average. This is, it's quite representative in its spatial distribution across Germany. But what is striking is the fact that they are exceptionally rich. So their income is exceptionally higher than the income of other income millionaires in Germany. So their average is around 6 million per year, while the national is less than half. So yes, there is some potential, and it resonates also with the prior experiences in interviews that we had here in Heidelberg. There's not only Klaus Tschira, there's a number of other billionaire foundations in this small region. So thirdly, the number of clubs. That is a study we would have loved to discuss further with Annette Zimmer, who unfortunately couldn't make it for today, and I'm taking her slot in this presentation. She's an expert on the legal structures and the operations of different types of clubs and associations in Germany. There's a whole law around it. So among the many clubs, and they can have all kinds of objectives, there's also the legal status of a charitable club. Charitable clubs don't pay taxes, and they have to be for good use in some way. So in the register of 5,131 clubs, they are all registered with a regional government, regional council. We identified those that are legally charitable, and also included them into our study. And we know that's around 1,200 clubs, in addition to the foundations, that do charitable work, that in part raise funds, and that have philanthropic activity. Right. So the core of the analysis then is the identification of philanthropic giving. And how would you possibly do that? Yesterday we had Michael's presentation on the UK, on the higher education philanthropy activities, and we learned that it was survey-based. So survey-based means either you have the foundations who report what and to whom they funded, or you have the universities who report, what and from how many they received. But surveys tend to be incomplete. So we look, and of course they can be subjectively manipulated. There is no formal, complete way to identify in the field donations, and the really best methodology we found is to go into publicized donations. So whenever a donation is made public, and of course we know that many foundations insist in being anonymous and unknown, but so as soon as it gets published, we screened all newspapers in the region for those donations. This is a typical entry. So what you see here, it's a German article in a German newspaper. You see the amount of the donation, 1,600 euro. You see the donor. It's actually the Lions Service Club who gives that money. You see the donee. That is a supportive club around a local school. And then you have the article that explains exactly what the purpose of this is. So Laura did the digital analysis. She screened the newspapers in the region with a total of 90 keywords. So we didn't want to miss anything. And then later on we decided whether it's a philanthropic act or not. And she came up with 2,000 and nearly 300 individual donations in the region over a period of 7 years, between 2004 and 2011. Okay, again, checking for the methodology. I know it's not complete, but to us it was really the best thing to do, and it's a lot of work to be done. We had to look at where the newspapers are actually sold, or where they are actually read. And this is a map that depicts the geographical structure of the catchment areas of the newspapers, and you see this is anything but an homogeneous region. It's quite diverse culturally. So the northern part of the region is already nearly Bavarian-Franconia, and their orientation is toward the next city in Bavaria. You see Swabian Hall, which is a region that also has entirely different newspapers than this core region around the city of Heilbronn with its industrial structure. So territorially, yes, a region. Administratively, yes, a region, but culturally, maybe less so. And the distribution of the newspaper, of course, then defines the kinds of news you get. The majority of the news were really found in this Heilbronner Stimme, the major newspaper distributed in the region. Okay, so what do we see? We see, and that is fully in line with what we have heard yesterday on philanthropy in the UK and in the US, numbers are rising. Within the short period of only 7 years, the number of donations doubled. It's quite a consistent and continuous slope upward. when we look at the volumes, like the amounts donated, we see that there's more volatility in here, but generally there's a trend towards increasingly more donations to beneficiaries. When we look at the purposes, and that's the one advantage we had from reading individually every article in the newspapers, we can really distinguish a great range of different purposes. No time to detail this here, but what we learn is the greatest number of donations, 1,000 donations, which is close to half of all donations being made, are really in the area of charity and humanitarian aid, the classical social support philanthropy. When we look at the volumes that have been given, we see that more than 60% of the volumes at a much lower rate of individual acts of donations goes into education, science, and research in this area. And I think that contradicts, it may be in the general trend that education is increasingly important philanthropy, but it somehow contradicts what we read about the 1990s, where humanitarian aid and charities were the dominant use and the dominant reason to give money. So now we go back to this limitations that we found being given by the third sector, as distinct from the first state sector and the second, the private sector. Looking at where the money comes from, we see that by far most, 60% of the amounts of donations given, but only a quarter of the acts of donations, of transactions, comes from foundations. The second, in terms of amounts, already are business firms that you would, I think, usually exclude. It would be something to be studied by people who do CSR, corporate social responsibility. So is it part of the civil society or not? You can tell me, we would say absolutely. These are philanthropic acts, and we don't care about their principal motivation, whether that's for profit or not, because it also it arrives at this region and it helps, and we will later on see how this interacts with other acts of philanthropy. Then you have individuals who have a minimal share in the number of transactions, but who take like the third largest share in the volumes, in the amounts of money given. So patrons are a few very wealthy individuals that by giving in a small number of transactions large amounts of money, which has an impact. It's the third largest player in this field in the region. And then you have the clubs and associations who are largest in terms of the number of transactions, but who are only in fourth place in terms of the amounts of money that they transfer. I think that's the first thing you can win from a field perspective, the diversity of actors. We then looked at how this interacts. So this is a simple matrix that distinguishes between donors, types of donors, so in rows, non-profit donors, and they donate to whom? To non-profit donees, to hybrid donees, or to for-profit donees even. The for-profit donee was the example I gave in the beginning, an entrepreneur who very early stage wanted to promote his research, his technical engineering research, to use a simple adhesive tape as a data repository. And he was just given the money without any expectations on sharing profits afterwards. We have this hybrid category that was introduced by Laura when we had discussions, because we saw that there's a number of projects and initiatives taken by distinct actors together. A local government, a local chamber of commerce, and a foundation may start a project together and collect money and receive additional donations. So where would you put that? Well, that's definitely a case of already like field internal hybrid joint activity. But again, we see that most, like by far the largest amount of donations go into non-profit, go into the non-profit sector. All right. 920 donors we identified by analyzing the newspapers made nearly 2,300 donations to a total of 1,200 beneficiaries. The aggregate amount that has been donated in those 7 years was 130 million euros. So our question was what kind of connectivity, what kind of topology such a transactional network would generate. And this is not even the whole network. This is just the main component. It's the largest cohesive part of a network that may have many, many other fully disconnected but locally connected further components. So this is only the major component, the main component. And it's interesting to see that this main component represents 60% of all the actors involved in the network, 3/4 of all the relations that exist in this field, but only 40% of the value of donations. So very obviously, this is not a network that we usually see when we study social and organizational networks that tends to be highly core periphery structured. It seems to be really fragmented, diverse. We have very few actors with a great number of relationships. But what we have typically is a majority of single type relations. So in that period, one-time donation to one beneficiary, that beneficiary not having any other donors, that donor not having many more beneficiaries. This seems to be the characteristic. So now you can do all kinds of analyses with networks. And we've just done some, very briefly, done some triadic census. A triadic census means that you take a network as a whole and you go through any tripartite potential relationships. So every actor in the network will be visited various times, whether he's, what's the relation between me, Kin, and Isan? What's the relation between me and Megan and Jennifer? What's the relation between me and Megan and Isan? So I would appear many, many times, and this is why you get this great number of 3 million in frequencies in this network. Okay, so you revisit all possible triads. And what we see is that more than 99% of the triads have just this one relationship. So a unique act, one time in 7 years, to give money to someone else. Only few cases in which we see situations where you have one donor who has several beneficiaries, or where you have one beneficiary who has several donors. And then there's more complex situations. There are not many. I mean, there's 1,000 already, but it's compared to the total of the relationships, really, really only minor, where you have intermediate relationships, where you see sorts of a vertical division of labor, somebody raising the funds, passing the money on to someone else who may be an operational foundation, who then uses that money or even passes it on to someone else to then pass it on to beneficiaries. It's something that in economic geography we would call a value chain, and I know that that term may be critical in the field of philanthropy study. But what we see here technically is a vertical division of labor. So we wanted to look into this and started a survey on all charitable foundations in the region, roughly 200. We saw that these foundations, again, fully in line with everything we've heard and know, were established only over the last 10 years, the great majority. So it's quite young foundations. We wanted to know to what extent these foundations seek collaboration, how they evaluate collaboration, whether it's useful or not, and to what extent they engage in collaboration among each other to leverage very small proprietary resources to combine them into better leverage. Okay, so 60% of the foundations that responded, we had a response rate of more than 50%, which is exceptionally good, I would say. They said, yes, cooperation is useful. It would definitely enhance the efficiency in the use of philanthropic assets. It's good. So the next question then was, do you collaborate with other philanthropic actors? And then you see there's a lot less collaboration, really. Only 40% said that yes, less than 50% said yes, we do this. And then we wanted to know, so when you collaborate, what is it that you're actually doing? And there are basically two types of collaboration. One is, in finance you would say the syndication, the co-financing of common projects together. That's rather simple because you just give money and someone else does too, and you don't have to coordinate really in the way you work together. And then there is the less frequent but more intensive ways of collaboration where you really work on common themes or even a common project in operational terms together. So you have to coordinate your work and you have to find some sort of active collaboration in what you do. So a lot less. Okay, so then we looked at the micro, like grossly, at the micro social structure. A foundation that wants to work. How does it find its resources? Is it just this one and ever the same source to one and ever the same beneficiary? Or are foundations more flexible? Are they looking for new ways to get new resources in order to realize philanthropic aid to new and other beneficiaries? And again, what you see, the response rate here is rather low on this issue, is that there is only there's only 20% if you calculate this in proportion, there's only 20% of the foundations that have varying donors, varying sources of income, and varying donees, like new groups that they foster. And take in mind, we're not talking about Germany or the UK or the US, we talk about a small region with 1 million inhabitants. So of course the field is also constrained territorially and by the number of actors. Okay, the last point here then is the regional dimension of this philanthropic field. Being geographers in the end, we wanted to come back to the question, to what extent does geography make a difference for the way that philanthropy works? And quite clearly, we see that philanthropy, yesterday, who was it? Megan, you said that 80% of philanthropic giving is local. Or was it you? Was it you? You said this, in the US. Well, it's, simply it's the same here. It's the same here, although we make a distinction between the local level, that is within a district, within one of those 5 districts, so very locally, the municipality if you like, and within the region, which can cross boundaries of a district within that broader region. So the number of transactions, like 60% of the transactions are really local, but only 20% of the budgets transferred are local. So again, here we have a very skewed distribution with a long tail of very small donations and a few major transactions that tend to be more regionally organized. And then third thing is there's a negative trade balance. So we see that of this total of 100% of donations made, 13% leave the region elsewhere. And only 7% come back, but that's not a critical issue. It's just an observation about the relationships beyond that region and in which ways. Okay, you can put this into a map that looks nicer but tells basically the same story. What's interesting here is that there is this one foundation in the region. I don't know whether, do you know a food retailer with the name Lidl? I think Lidl is also now has arrived in the US. So the founder of Lidl lives in the region of Heilbronn. And he is definitely one of the wealthiest persons in the south of Germany, maybe in Germany, and he has a foundation, and that foundation accounts for the lion's share of donations to the city of Heilbronn, and also to the, I think more than 90% of the donations that leave the region are this one player. And this is something that has to be taken into account also when you compare it to the presentation of Megan yesterday. You looked at 4 foundations that would be similar to this one foundation, but this one foundation is less than 1% of the entire population of foundations. So there's really a great variety, and most of what happens locally, but it's not the big foundations that take broader perspectives in themes, and therefore broader perspectives in terms of territorial giving. Then we studied, and I'm finishing in a moment, then we studied the differences between the different types of actors, the diversity of the field. And there's a number of differences you could tell, but you see, for example, that corporations, business firms, private philanthropic giving has a different geographical pattern than foundations. So especially in the volumes. The foundations have, the 50% of the foundation's activity is locally within the municipality or just next municipality. So a reach of, let's say, 5-6 kilometers. Whereas corporations seem to have a broader perspective. So half of their philanthropic resources moved are within the region or even beyond. And there are many more differences, and no time to discuss them here in detail, but it's just a starting point to think about or to acknowledge the diversity in so many regards and how this could be used in a region as a complementary way of action. So the final example is, and the final question was, when we take field perspective and we look at the connectivity, in the end we are interested in taking joint actions and in bringing together diverse resources. I began by comparing Heilbronn-Franconia with Coventry, structurally similar regions and cities in two different countries in Europe, where one has 2 first-star universities and the other has none. And this is something the region has realized. So the Dieter Schwarz Foundation, the founder of Lidl, has initiated a great number of repeated donations to grow a local campus of education. And he's done this, he could never have done this alone. He needed other support. He needed local government, because spatial development in Germany is highly regulated. You cannot just simply build constructions. You need local government to set the urban plan for it and engage with it. And you need also other actors that work together. For example, the existing educational institutions that partly relocated to this one physical site. So this is the plan of this one physical site called Education Campus, Bildungscampus. It's for a student who doesn't know about the organizational boundary, it looks like just one university, but really what you have is you have 4 or 5 different types of polytechnical and other specialized educational institutions. It's not a comprehensive, real university. The German word university is legally protected to only those like Heidelberg, for example. Others are polytechnical and so on. So they're for applied sciences and more vocational. And recently, in 2018, the Dieter Schwarz Stiftung, and I made this announcement yesterday when we had the general discussion, or before the general discussion, had found an agreement with the Technical University of Munich, which is one of the internationally leading technical universities. They are highly entrepreneurial, they act like Stanford, they raise a lot of money, and they have an agreement with the Dieter Schwarz Foundation to take their money, create 20 new full professorships, with each having an individual team of staff of researchers, where 7 stay in Munich and 13 are allocated to the Bildungscampus in Heilbronn-Franconia. So what happens? The region of Heilbronn-Franconia forms part of the federal state of Baden-Württemberg. Education and higher education is entirely a federal autonomy. Now we have a Bavarian university that operates degrees, and it's all innovation and management, it's business professorships, all of them. They're all just business professorships, how to manage innovation. They're now operated in Baden-Württemberg, and you can imagine how the Technical University of Karlsruhe or even Heidelberg thought about this. They felt highly, provoked by this action, and they wondered, why didn't we get this money? Why weren't we not able, to use that philanthropic money to extend our own programs to this peripheral region? But now, 2018, after only 15 years of development, something which is hard to think for a German, the foundation managed to get a full university program to this region where there was no university before. This is extremely quick, and it demonstrates how of course, one dominant actor, but also how the orchestration of collaboration between different kinds of actors from different sectors is able to leverage an interest in education to such an extent that it will, on the long term, most likely be very beneficial for the region. Let me close. I admitted that this research is rather explorative. It's not big theory, but it started by changing the way we look at philanthropy and defining the philanthropic field as the principal analytical framework. So actors are a consequence of the actions, and we look at the actions first and then classify the actors. And that's, I think, the reversal that we do when compared to the conventional literature that we found. When we look at a field, we can study its connectivity, and we saw basically that it's rather loosely connected. There is an appraisal of collaboration, but the reality of collaboration is really inferior. We have seen a lighthouse example of what collaboration can really produce as an effect for society, like really getting higher education into a region. But there's a lot of limitations to foundations in terms of visibility and willingness and risk-taking in order to really bring resources together and collaborate. And I think I'll leave it here, and thank you very much for your attention.